So that's one of the benefits of the open source world, is that everything happens in the open. So that means that anything that goes wrong happens in the open, and it's for everyone to see, analyze, and learn.
You're listening to Data Revolution,
the show about data, innovation, and economics in the rapidly changing cloud world.
Hey, Francesco, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm amazing. It's always nice to see you. So I heard you sat down with Flor and Josep.
I sat down with a couple of interesting people at Ivan. Flor is the staff community program manager, and Josep is the director of the open source office. And we talk a lot about open source, the state, the current state, and the future of open source, and how we can make it more sustainable. How companies and individuals can contribute in order to make open source something that is shared in the community, that is not only the effort of a single person working during the night and the weekend and burning themselves down without any money, but it could be a kind of a social project that is shared across a lot of people that is bringing all the community forward.
That sounds great. And honestly, I'm excited to hear what you talked about with them, because I personally am more in the serverless space with where I've been in my career the last couple of years. So open source community, what's going on, I'm really excited to hear about what you talked about.
Yeah, it was really interesting discussion and fun.
Awesome. Well, let's check it out.
Flor, Josep, it's a pleasure having you here. Josep, let's start from you. Recently, I saw that there was some noise about a breach in some open source package, and most of the times I don't know precisely what I'm saying. But something caught my eyes that it was called XZ.
Yep.
Can you tell me a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so that was a really long orchestrated attack onto the pipeline of open source. And it was really hard to detect because it was happening in such a small pace and so slow that many people didn't realize what was happening. And it was just thanks to one single person working on internet, which is a well-known Postgres contributor, who realized that his pipeline was some milliseconds slower than usual. Yes, milliseconds slower than usual, after he was trying a new package, a new beta package, a new release candidate. And then he realized that something was wrong. And he started pulling the thread from there, and he realized that there was malicious code into one of the most used tools on basically using all the Unix systems. And he started looking around and doing forensic analysis on what happened. And it turns out that a malicious user, which we don't know much yet, but we just know that there was a GitHub account created several years ago that did legit contributions to projects and continued gaining trust until managed to sneak in some malicious code that affected the library and made it in because people trusted that person. They were doing contributions for a while, and suddenly they decided to turn rogue, maybe. That's, again, we don't know much what happened, but they managed to infiltrate and get malicious code into the library. Thanks to these vigilant people that are always looking and trying things out before they go to the mainstream market, they realized that that was something strange going on, and we could stop it right in time.
Okay, this sounds quite scary.
And it is.
Yes. My question then, is this only a peculiar thing related to open source, or could it happen everywhere? And Flor, from you, I would like to understand also how much of this, of the open source code, is part of non-open source tooling? Because, I mean, you can have direct adoption of open source or indirect, not direct adoption of open source. So can you tell me a little bit more about how open source is used in the world, and if this kind of attack would only happen with open source tools?
I mean, open source is used everywhere. Many enterprise or bigger companies, they have at least 90% of their code base is open source or has an open source source, literally. Everybody could be victim of something like this, but then again, of course, this could also happen if you're building a proprietary product or you're using proprietary software. But then in that case, that person would maybe be working for you, and you would have their social security number. You would know how to find them. It's a kind of a different situation. So it's less likely that someone would actually have that malicious intent and like work at a company for a longer amount of time to try and infiltrate something in the code base. And so open source, of course, has a little bit more of an abstraction layer, and it's harder to find out where someone lives, for instance, by just using their GitHub account, which might or might not. That's not something that you can easily find out. So, yes, you're maybe a bit more at risk when you're using open source, but it has other benefits too, of course.
Well, I mean, the risk is that everybody can, contribute. But on the other side, when Josep was talking about the forensic analysis, I don't think you can really do that with a closed enterprise product from outside. So you need to rely only on the people inside doing the forensic analysis for you. Or at least you cannot go to the code level.
So that's one of the benefits of the open source world, is that everything happens in the open. So that means that anything that goes wrong happens in the open, and it's for everyone to see, analyze, and learn. When something happens in the closed source, it happens within the firewalls of a enterprise. And I don't mean like the firewalls as in the software firewalls, but basically the protection of what happens within a company stays within the company. And usually you never know what really happened. We can see this thing with data breaches, that we sometimes never learn about those ones, only when there is a leak that we know that, oh yeah, apparently that there was a data breach at that company XYZ, and that amount of data was lost, or that amount of data was leaked into the black market. But in the open source, whenever there is a problem, it's known, public. And we have the CVE, for example, where you can you report officially and publicly what are the vulnerabilities that are happening on open source software. And that's public, open, and there is also the mitigation steps for those problems. So all this transparency helps on learning, making things more robust on the open source, while that thing it's not guaranteed to happen on proprietary software.
So what you're saying is basically that if your software is your body, with open source you have full visibility on whatever is going around, while on the other side you trust whoever built your body, basically. More or less.
That could be a good analogy. So you have X-ray, and you can basically scan your own self and see what's wrong with you. While if you are in corporate software, what you see is what we have with our own eyes. We just see our skin, and we cannot go deeper. We need special machines. We need to understand, or we need to trust what other people say that they saw with other special machines.
Or that you have to ask to a special photographer to come and take a picture of you.
Yep.
Perfect. We were talking about how much companies are using open source in order to drive their own code. So, Josep, if open source is so important, why does open source have problems? And can you go more in detail about which problems does open source have?
One of the problems that I believe that open source has is the English language, because usually we talk about free software, and free means different things in English language. Not in other languages. I, for example, speak Spanish and Catalan. These are my two mother tongues, and in that we have two different words for free. One is the concept of free as in freedom, the other one is free as in not paying. So many people take the free software that should be about freedoms, or basically freedoms for the end users of the software, but they take free as in not paying. So many companies use the free software just because it's free of cost, while we should be using them because it's freeing them from restrictions. So that means that many companies go there just for the monetary benefits. As in, I don't need to pay any license for that. I'm using that software, and for me, it's a commodity. I don't need to invest any money on there. But that's the wrong way of saying it. So these projects, they are free. They guarantee the freedoms to you, but they need a lot of efforts and contributions from the companies using it so they can keep these freedoms farther down. And the problems that we have right now is that many companies do use open source software. Flor was mentioning, like, stack of most companies is based off 90 99% or 95% of open source software. Some companies might even have all their dependencies being open source, and only the proprietary part is what they write. And the problem is they mostly don't contribute back to this stack that they depend on. And that's something we need to change. We need to change from corporations, from companies, from the open source world, from the communities, to make sure that people understand that they rely on software, and that software is not written on its own. It's written by people. And these people need support. Sometimes they need monetary support by donations, but sometimes they need support as in help, as in developers contributing as well in work time to contributing to these projects. Right now, many projects are just done on the weekends, on the afternoons. Many other ones are heavily worked on work times. Linux kernel, for example, that's one perfect example on how a project is well maintained. There are big corporations that they spend full-time employees working on that software. I'm not saying every single software should go that path, should be spending that amount of money, but we should learn more from these type of collaborations. They don't go there, what's in for me, what it's in for my corporation, but rather what's in for the project. How can we improve the project so the project is better, so we can be better as a company, we can get more benefits as a company.
Josep, you touched a series of important points about contributing back, about trying to move the project itself together by writing code, by understanding the need of the project, and with foundation baking up also this kind of big projects. And the key thing about collaboration, I believe, needs to be explained. Flo, can you explain a little bit better the various type of people involved in open source project and how they make the difference for these projects?
Right. So when Joseph also mentioned companies getting involved with open source projects, I think we should look very much beyond code contributions too, because a lot of these projects are just like startups basically, and they need a lot of different roles. They need help in different areas. They will need help trying to figure out what kind of funding schemes are out there, what kind of like license structures are out there, and maybe get some advice on that. They might need marketing help. They might need help running that community. What they mostly lack is people actually going through issues and doing triaging of issues, and like figuring out what's going on next and reviewing pull requests. Those are largely like thankless type jobs because they don't add lines of code, which is like a very visible way of contributing to a project, but it's not necessarily the main thing that a project might need. So that sort of diversity of roles in a project is something that I think a lot of projects need help with to fill all of those different needs.
Okay, you are talking about huge amount of different figures, huge amount of different people involved in a project. On the other side, what you mentioned, Joseph, before was that a lot of the projects are single person working on the weekend. So can you elaborate more on this and why this is a problem for the open source community?
Yeah, so there are ecosystems where that is even bigger and more prominent than in other ecosystems. I would probably say that the JavaScript ecosystem is one of the ones that has this pattern the most, which is a lot of smaller libraries, mostly maintained by one single person, that is becoming the foundation of other libraries that, again, they are built by one single person, which in turn they depend on and on and on. And it's an endless cycle that we end up having a long chain of dependency for smaller libraries to bigger libraries each increment. But each of them is supported and maintained by one single person each time. And most of the times a different person. Sometimes the same one. So what happens is that those projects, all of them, they have a pass factor of 1. Like somebody refers also these ones as lottery factor, as in if you would get the lottery, you would probably forget about these projects and how many people need to win the lottery, so the project is dysfunctional. Mm-hmm. So nobody else works on the project. However, that sometimes works strangely in the open source, because some people might say, if I win the lottery, finally I would dedicate all my full time.
I can work on open source all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, but we have some weird people like that as well. I know a couple of those. But the factor is how many people are how many people away of stop contributing to the project are we from total failure of the project. And most of them, they are a factor of one. Just one person goes away and the whole project is in failure. Nobody else contributes back. So that means that we have a lot of parts of our infrastructure that we run every single day that rely on single people work. And we basically are at the expense of them saying, I want to continue doing this work, or I don't want to continue doing this work. How we can mitigate this thing, it all depends. Some of these projects that they are single person projects, they might need money. They might need a way of getting funding. As in, I want to convert this side thing into my main job. I want to be able to sustain me and my life with these projects. So that would be one way. The other way is like, no, I don't need that. I have already a job, but it's too much work. I need people who help me do all the maintenance tasks that need to be done. So Flora was mentioning reviewing PRs, helping me doing project management, help me doing triaging, all that thing. Maybe what they need is just more people joining, offering support and help, full-time, part-time, whatever works, on moving the project forward. And the problem with that is that if we don't change that, if we don't change the balance right now, these people will at one point in time stop doing things. We need to replace that, we need to fork those projects, or we need to change the way that we are thinking about our infrastructure in open source, how we need to start caring about that and actively working with our dependencies on how we make them sustainable.
That's a lot. It's a lot, but from a consumer point of view, so you are talking about people, you are people that are fully involved in open source. From a consumer point of view, how can I assess the risk? If I need to onboard a new, library, how can I evaluate the risk of the lottery factor or other risks associated to that library being sustainable on the long term? Josep.
If I would have the answer to this one, everyone will be following me asking for numerical numbers on health on projects, because that's the $1 million question in the open source world. So we don't have a way to deterministically explain or numerically assign a risk factor on projects. We have a combination of gut feeling with cold numbers that we need to put together and magically mix and give some oracle looking into the future options of what might happen. But there is things that what Flor was pointing before, that you need to look at how many people are involved, how many roles are being covered, how many actions are being happening in the project. Do we have enough people reviewing code? Do we have enough people contributing code? Do we have enough documentation? Do we have enough explanation on how the project works? These are things that are superficial on the project. You don't need to go really deep. You can see from above and from the outside if the project is moving on the right directions and on the right dimensions. Then you need to start looking at deeper into the code as well, like who contributes, where, how, when people stopped or started contributing, who are the active contributors, and then who is backing those contributors. That sometimes is complicated to find. There is not always like a public record of, yeah, I'm getting funding from XYZ, but how is the people who are maintaining the project supporting themselves? Are they employed by a company X and that's sponsored fully by this thing? Are they getting funding by themselves, asking, pay me a beer? That happens sometimes. You can see these buttons, buy me a coffee. These buttons are micro donations. Are they getting sponsored by micro donations? Are they part of a bigger foundation? These are the whole questions that you need to go and try to find out and guess things in there and get some feeling of how of a risk they are.
So I believe the risk calculation is a mix of public information and investigation that you need to do on other platforms, like, trying to find in LinkedIn if someone has a job or stuff like that.
There are, of course, certain tools out there like Chaos Metrics that will look at a couple of those data points that you mentioned too, right? In terms of like how many contributors are there, from what kind of companies are there, maybe what's the activity like, what's the, if there's a consistent release cycle, a couple of those things that sort of indicate a project health. There's definitely something out of there, but there will always be a little bit of a, you mentioned gut feel. I think there's always a little bit of a gut feel. And for that, you need to understand how open source communities work. Otherwise, it's very hard to, I think, to assess any of that.
And specifically the community you are assessing.
Yeah.
Right? Because each community has its own ways of working,
Yes.
idiosyncrasies, and you need to understand what's in that one and the other one.
Yeah.
So far we understood that there are metrics and ways to measure the risk of a project being sustainable on the long term. Now, if myself as a company or a contributor or a developer want to try to decrease the risk of a project that I want to onboard, what can I do, Flo?
Right, so you have done your due diligence and you figured out that's the tool that I want to use. And through your due diligence, you have seen that there are some parts where they can improve, and that's maybe parts where you could help out. So
That's a nice way of phrasing the question, yes.
right?
Yep.
Yeah. Would you have wished that you would have phrased it that way?
Yeah, like we can, with AI, we can change
We
my
can-
voice to
to-
your voice, and that's it.
Exactly. Okay, great. So you've identified the areas in which the project maybe shows some weaknesses, and that's maybe parts where you can step in, right? And that's something that you could offer. What I've seen is, like, again, there's different types of roles that drive a project forward, and so maybe there's a role that you could take, especially as a reviewer, sort of like really to invest in that community. That would be a good point. If you can invest money in a project through foundation membership, or by employing people working on the project, or any kind of funding scheme that is out there, GitHub sponsors, tight lifters, there's several options that you could do. I think a lot of people still sort of operate under the illusion that all open source software or developers they don't want to be paid because it's more hardcore to work on open source in your basement or whatever. Turns out that most people actually want to pay their bills, and so it's actually a pretty good way to support any kind of work in open source too.
So open source contributors don't eat only air. I mean,
No.
Turns out they don't.
No, we usually try to eat food as well, every now and then, not always.
Okay.
Also Cheetos and Mountain Dew.
So this is from a kind of single contributor point of view. What about from corporates? And corporates are using open source. How can they contribute back or make a project more sustainable on the long term?
So I would basically try to encourage them to have an open source program office, for example, that can understand better the landscape that they are facing and they're dealing with, the type of number and different types of open source projects they rely on, and what type of necessity they do have. Once that's established, then they can start analyzing what they need. But mostly, the corporations might be able to contribute back with either money, which is a clear one, that they might need to contribute back money. Sometimes in money as in monetary donations, but sometimes as in you need hardware to run CI, for example. We can donate that hardware for you. We can donate those pipelines for you, so you don't need to pay that on your own pocket. We sponsor that thing. Forget about that bill. One thing less to worry about. But also another thing you can contribute back is with people working time, like paying people to work full time on these open source projects and giving that time back to the project, but not to exercise some themes that I want only me to execute on the project as a corporation. I want these features done, I do these things and I disappear, but rather a sustained contribution and collaboration with the projects. That's what's beneficial for the projects, for the future, and to make them more sustainable. And that's something that they can do. One thing that many companies or many corporations do not understand, we have services as a corporation, you have many different services, and you have teams that maintain and develop those services. But we tend to forget that all our infrastructure, in the end, is also something we rely on. But we dedicate zero resources into making that successful. We should dedicate some resources also to our infrastructure.
It's, I believe, a way of companies to give back where also they take some value from. And going back to the discussions that we were doing before, I felt that what you said about the OSPO team is doing a little bit of the forensic work that we were talking before, but also being able to help the project to going forward in the best way for the project itself. And the follow-up question is, Josep, I believe you are a little bit involved in this kind of activity with Ivan. Can you tell me a little bit more about how Ivan contributes to
Yep.
open source projects?
So yeah, I am heading the open source program office at Ivan, and every open source program office in every company does something that the company needs. So every single open source program office is different from the next one. So the thing we do doesn't mean that it's the right way of doing, or that every single company should do it the same way. That's what we need to do in our OSPO to make sure that Ivan can benefit from having an OSPO. So what we do, we employ people to work full-time on upstream projects. So 100% of the time of our developers is working on upstream projects. They contribute code, they review code, they help triaging code, they help reviewing and releasing code that it's being like new releases of the projects. And the way we choose the projects is clearly by what Ivan offers as a service. We need to make sure that these projects have a right health, they are sustainable, that they are not depending on one single vendor as much as we can. Sometimes it's more complicated than others. There are some open source projects that they are a single vendor and they might always be a single vendor, but we don't want to leave the single vendor alone by being the only one contributing. We want to also contribute back so we can also help and support the project. So it's not left alone to one single vendor. And that's what we do. We contribute to every single, to most of the open source projects that Ivan relies on and offers as a service.
If I remember well, our contribution are not limited to the OSPO team and are not limited to the open source tools that we offer.
No.
So my question is, what else are we doing at Ivan?
So as I said before, the open source program office has a group of developers who constantly and 100% work on upstream. This is the baseline of contributions that we want to make sure that the projects are always enjoying, so that they can have a guaranteed level of contributions back from Ivan. But then we encourage everyone from the company to contribute as they see fit and as they see working on their skills, project needs, and in any project dependency that they have. And that's one of the things we do.
So I think that is really a unique program for Ivan. So I'm really glad that exists, that everybody can get involved in open source in any way they think they can best contribute, right? So that could be reviewing documentation, reviewing pull request, organizing community events and spending time on that. And I think that's a very, very strong thing that we can do. Again, that plays into everyone's strengths.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Always.
You said that you can contribute, you can do all these things. What is the Plankton program?
So the Plankton program is a program aimed to all Ivaners, to all employees who want to contribute to open source projects outside of the working hours. What they do is they contribute to any open source project, you report the hours back, and Ivan compensates back that effort you put on these open source contributions. The only restriction is that you need to contribute something on a project that has an open source license. And contributing here is in the broader sense of contribution. Anything. Contributing is in helping, in contributing, in making sure that the project goes further, not just code contribution.
Yeah, I think the beauty too is that this is work that people would anyway do, and to be compensated for that is a very beautiful thing.
And I mean, the other beautiful thing, I believe, it's that it's not only aimed at our developers.
No.
If you are a designer and there is a project with a need of a design, well, that's open source contribution as well. So it's really open to anybody in Ivan.
Correct.
Last question for you both. Let's talk about the future. What's in your open source wish list?
A world where projects can live without worrying about money. No, I mean, that's too idealistic. But basically, what I would like to see in the near future, that it's realistic, is the understanding for bigger corporations that they cannot just simply use open source projects and stop there. They need to start looking back at these open source projects and see how they can help the open source project. The open source project is helping them by providing all that code so they can build nicer things and bigger things. So they need to realize that they need to look back and ask what we can do also for you.
Flo?
Well, not necessarily wish list, but being realistic. And you called out the responsibilities that companies have. They will actually have the responsibility with the upcoming Cyber Resilience Act. They need to actually own their stack and figure out. We're all going to be responsible for the security of those projects and the longevity of those projects. So we're actually going to have to do all of these things. So better get started soon, no?
So I believe now companies will have to start acting in one way or the other in your wish list or based on your good set of flows. The set of flows that you mentioned, which is the
Cyber Resilience Act.
Can you explain just a little bit more what is the CRA?
So the CRA is a framework law on the European Union that is trying to react to these recent security threats that we've seen on the open source space. There has been some bumpy roads getting into the final text of the CRA where open source was not really understood by the legislators, and we finally got together, legislators and open source community, to get a text that is now closer to what the reality of the world of open source is. Because at one point in time, the law was not reflecting what open source contributions are and how we exist in the world. Nowadays, we have a framework law. The framework law is not actionable yet. It's something that will be implemented in each country, and each country will have its own version of it. So there is nothing we can say as in how will it look like specifically. Each country will have its own implementation, but we can say that each country will implement a law that will follow these guidelines, that companies creating software or benefiting of open source software need to have some responsibilities towards the end users, which is the European Union citizens, so they are always safe and kept out of threats as much as you can be.
Okay, so it seems to me that the CRA is going to somehow help open source project to be a little bit more sustainable on the long term.
We will try to keep the stack of open source security of the open source a little bit more secure while keeping threats to the end user at bay. But that's, again, only a try, an attempt. How it will turn out, we will see once the laws are written and we start to see the implementations of those and how we start executing those.
So I believe that will be the best appointment to have another episode of this podcast. Flo, Josep,
Sounds good.
Thanks for sitting with me and thanks for talking about sustainable open source.
Thank you.
So that was a really interesting conversation you had with Josep and Flor. I personally thought the part where you all talked about how contribution to open source versus usage is very uneven.
Yeah, I mean, Flo gave a lot of good statistics about the reach of open source into open source and enterprise software. Basically, almost everybody is using open source in one way or the other. But on the other side, we don't see the same level of contributions back. And I believe this is a key factor to make open source more sustainable, is to realize that we are part of a bigger community. We need to hold each other's hands. And if you have a chain that is composed by multiple rings, the chain is as strong as the weakest ring. If we can help the weakest ring to be more sustainable, more strong, we win as a chain together.
Definitely. So since you said key factor, I will say that was the first time I've heard of lottery factor. I said before that I'm still getting ramped up on the open source community, but I really thought the lottery factor conversation was insightful.
Yeah, the lottery factor conversation, it's very interesting because with just 2 words, it tells you a reality. There are a lot of projects out there that are maintained by a single person during the weekend. And despite the fact that a lot of people do this for passion, you never know what's going to happen. If you have only one person doing a task for the entire world, the entire community, if this person wins the lottery, goes to Bahamas, Maldives, they choose whatever they want, then you start with the analogy that we were using before, missing a ring. And the entire chain can go down. So it's critical that we ensure that all our rings are strong, and maybe that we have not only one ring, but a couple, 3, 4 rings, just in case one ring decides to go elsewhere. So I feel that making open source more sustainable is something that will make all the community, the entire ecosystem of both technological ecosystem, but also the society, a lot better, because it means that we are taking care of each other. We are helping each other to progress to the future.
I do believe sustainable open source is a topic that we should be talking about in general in the industry and how businesses and organizations are contributing. So thanks so much for sitting down with me and meeting with Josep and Flor.
Thank you, Jenki.